All right, so in this video, we're going to show you how to use Angular validation to do some simple form validation and give the user some feedback on fields that would not meet a particular criteria of data type or a particular structure. Okay, so here we've loaded the style sheet library, we've loaded the Angular core library, and we're going to do our programming in app.js. So let's declare here an application, ng app, and we'll call the application the validation app. There we go. Let's create here a controller for where we can interact with the user interface. Let's see, we'll call this container fluid, and we'll associate a controller, and we'll call it the validation controller. Okay, as model. There we go. Okay, so in here, let's start by adding a form. We haven't used forms at all throughout the semester, but this used to be the main mechanism by which web pages submitted data to servers, right? We use a form, and then we would point out that the data would be submitted to the server by filling out a particular URL where the data would be submitted, right? So action, we would submit it to some URL saying that we want to go to myformhandler.php or JSP or ASP, somebody on the server listening for this incoming request, right? And here we would have some input field that requested, for instance, maybe for login purposes, we would have a field named username, maybe another field that grab the user password, and we would so when this was submitted, the data would be gathered at the client side or the browser side. It would be encoded in the URL and sent over to the server. Let me just demonstrate that. Let me first paint this a little bit pretty. There we go, class form control. And let's put a button here for submission. So type submit, and the button might say submit the form. And let's paint this as a button. Block, and let's paint it blue. Okay, there we go. So let's bring this this index. Let's run it. There we have a form, and let's see. It's complaining, saying that we don't actually have an Angular application, right? So let me remove that dependency just for a second. Okay. So no controller just yet. Okay, no app.js just yet. Okay, let's just a regular form, right? Just a regular form. So notice that if I type something here, the username and password, and I submit, notice what's happening here, right? Notice that the URL at the top, the browser has parsed our form, right? And it read that there are fields, username and password, right? And it read the values there and encoded the request in the URL, right? And put them at the end in a query string. See that? Okay. This is a default way we used to handle forms, way back way back when. We still do this, right? This is still widely used, right? But we're moving away from this, right? More into using a single page application like we've been using for the last 2 or 3 months, right? We don't use the form anymore. Instead we use Ajax, right, to read the values from the input fields. We collect that into a JSON object and then send that over to the server. So we're moving away from this, but I do want to point out a couple of things here. One of the things that we could do is to configure these fields to be, for instance, required. Notice that there is a standard required attribute in the field, and this is used by the browser, right? To make sure that you do fill out some values for these things in there, right? So that if the form is submitted, right? If the form is submitted and right, and you forgot to fill out certain fields, if I submit, let me refresh. If I submit, notice that it did not submit, right? The browser is doing some minor validation saying, hey, that field was tagged as required. I am not going to submit this unless you give me that value for that field. Right? So the form does some pre-validation for us. It could also check to see, for instance, if it's an email and you've declared this to be of type email and that it's also required, right? If you do provide the username, let's refresh. If you do provide the username and try to submit this, notice that it says that this field is also required, so it's stopping me. It's not sending bogus information to the server. But if you provide a bogus email, it stops you also, right? Checking to see that this is not a valid email, right? So already by default, out of the box, the browser does this. It's pretty standard. It's all from HTML5 standard, and all browsers support this simple validation, right? But if you add an @ sign, that's still not enough. But if you have just a username @ and then some domain and you submit, then it takes that value and sends it over to the server. Obviously, we don't have anybody on the server listening for this incoming request, but that's besides the point, right? That's not what we're trying to look at here. So we can certainly add quite a bit of JavaScript to validate this and highlight certain things and remind users that this is required and paint its background and whatnot. Give some hints, so that's become so standard, right, of how to do this that libraries have been built around this this requirement of validating. Okay, and so I like to show you what Angular has to offer. Okay. So one of the first things is that if we're going to be using Angular, we're definitely not going to be using the default behavior of submitting something to the server, right? That's a no-no, right? That's an Angular. The way Angular works is that we instead do that all through Ajax, right? We grab we create objects that represent this data, and then we send it under the covers using Ajax. Yes? So we're definitely not going to do that, so we remove that. Also, we're going to tell the browser not to validate. I don't want this, the default browser's validation. Instead, Angular is going to take over. It says, browser, don't worry about this. I don't want you to validate. Instead, I'm going to do the validation. Okay? So we're going to tell. So this no validate attribute tells the browser to never mind. I don't want your default validation. I will take over from here. Okay? All right. Okay. Let's name this form. Let's call it form 1. Okay. And since this is going to be an Angular fields, right? We're going to tie this to a model, right? We're going to say that this is a user .username, right? So there'll be some object called user that has a particular attribute username, and so now this input field is bound to that object and that property, right? So let's create that also for the email, ng model user and that email, right? And we'll need now our application back, ng app, right? ng validation app, and let's create our app over here. There's our Angular app. Let's actually create that. We don't have that, right? So let's just create it over here in a JavaScript file, app.js. So here, let's create a dummy application really quick using our iffy design pattern, angular dot module can't type today. So this will be validation app. And for now, we're not going to have any dependencies. Right? There we go. We have the simplest of Angular applications. We're not going to do much over here. Instead, we're going to do most of our work here in the client side, on the browser side. All right. Let's refresh the page to make sure that we didn't break anything. Okay, we did break something. Let's see. Okay, it's asking for a controller. We're not really going to need a controller, so I'm going to just comment out the controller for now. I'm going to comment out the controller. Okay, there we go. So we're back. It's the page is okay, right? So let's see what Angular does for us. Okay. Excuse me. let's see what Angular does for us. Right? So one of the things that Angular does for us is that notice that we named the form. See that? We named the form form1. Right? And because now we have a model associated to the form, right? We have a user model associated to the form, right? And what Angular does is that it uses that name of the form, form1, right, to create a report for us and say, and create a meta information about that form. Is there anything wrong with the form? Okay, is there any validation that went wrong with the form? And it creates an object of the same name called form1 and makes it available to us in the current scope. Okay, so that if we say form1 or not form2, form1. Okay, and let's put it in the container. Right, notice that we get an object. Okay, we didn't create this object, right? This object was created for us, right, by Angular. Right, just by naming the form, right, it creates a brand new JSON object that reports anything that might be wrong with the form, right, and also any meta information about whether the form has been submitted, whether the form are there any errors in the form, right, and what those errors might be. All right, let's this is a pretty large object. Let me copy it for you and let me put it in a formatted so that we can read it and make sense out of it. Okay, so there it is. It's an object. It has quite a few attributes here. It's got error object. It has the name of the form, whether the form is dirty. Okay, that means that you have interacted, or maybe you've submitted, you've done something with any of the fields in the form. It has, is it valid? Is it invalid? Okay, notice that it's keeping track that it's not valid, $sign valid, see that? It's invalid probably because some of the fields are required and I haven't yet typed into the fields, okay? So it's keeping track of what's wrong. Also notice that has username and email, see that? All the fields in the form, right? For each field in the form, it creates an object, right? Of the same name, right? Username and email. If you open them, right? It has quite a few information about that particular field, right? It says that first it has the an overall meta information about the form in general, right? But then it has meta information about the individual fields, right? Of what might be wrong with the field. Okay, so notice that it has information about whether it was untouched, meaning has anybody ever interacted with this field? Has anybody even clicked on it? Okay, has anybody typed into the field? Right. So it gives you quite a bit of information, right, on the life cycle of each one of those fields. You know, has anybody typed? Has anybody blur the field, right? If you have tabbed away, right, or have you ever interacted with it? So it has those information: untouched, touched, pristine. Pristine meaning nobody has ever touched this, right? Nobody has ever typed into it, so it's a pristine field. Is it dirty? No. So right, it has pristine. So those are kind of like opposites of each other, right? It can be either dirty or pristine, but not both at the same time. Is it valid? Is it invalid? Right, so notice that valid is false, invalid is true, right, because it's required, right? It also has, notice it has an error object over here, right, that keeps track why is it invalid, right? Why is it invalid? If I click on it, notice that it says required true. That's why there's an error, right, because it is required, right? So we could use this object, right, to report back to the user and say, hey, this is what's wrong with the form. Right, we could highlight certain things and change colors and give feedback to the user. All right, so let's see how we can use this object to report back to the user. Also, a couple other things. If you look behind each one of these fields, right? If you look behind the curtain, right, you'll notice that each input field, Angular has added quite a few classes that we didn't add here. Right? Notice the input field. We added the class form control, you see that? But several other classes were added. ng pristine, ng empty, ng invalid required, ng touched, right? All those classes were added by Angular, right? Reporting back to the so that we can use those classes to then paint the input field in different colors. Okay, for instance, we could grab this this invalid. We can grab that invalid class, right, and style it. We can say style, right, style all the classes ng invalid. Style them with a background color of red. Okay, so that if now I refresh the page, notice that everything is painted red, right? Because they were tagged as required, and I haven't typed anything in there, right? So as far as we're concerned, these two fields are invalid until I actually type something in there, right? When I type something in there, the class of invalid is removed, right? So it's no longer painted red. Make sense? Right, what about the email? The email, right? If we look behind at the email, we inspect it. There's the input field, right? Again, notice all the classes that were added by Angular. ng pristine, meaning I haven't typed anything in that field. It's empty. It's ng valid email invalid. ng invalid required, right? So let's type something in there. Notice that if I start typing, look at the classes. They change as I type. See that? Okay. So let's say it says. Notice that the ng invalid email was added. See that? Right. Also, notice now it's valid required, meaning because I started typing, right? So that is removed. If I make it into a valid email, notice that now it goes back to white. Make sense? Right. Now notice that it's a little annoying, right? That I haven't even submitted the form, and you're already complaining that there's something wrong with the form, right? So what we'd like to be able to do is perhaps be a little bit more nuanced about giving feedback to the user, right? Don't give me the feedback that's wrong if I haven't even submitted the form. Give me a chance, right? So we could combine these classes along with, notice all these classes that were added to the form itself. See that? The form itself is added some more meta information about the form being dirty, about the form either being submitted or not being submitted. Notice that if I submit the form, notice that an additional class is added. See that? ng submitted. ng submitted. See that? So we could use this combination of the form being submitted and something being wrong with the field, right? To paint the report back to the user feedback when the form is submitted, as opposed to just painting it red all the time. So we could add the class in front of this, ng submitted, right? And then as a parent class in front of the ng invalid. Make sense? Right? So let's try this again. If I save this, and I go back and I refresh, notice that it's white, right? Meaning there's nothing wrong, right? Because the form hasn't yet been submitted, right? Only when I submit would I want to report back to the user that there's something wrong, right? Okay. Right. Same thing, right? If I give values for both of them and then I submit, right? Notice that the first one is not invalid because it's required and I did provide value, right? But the email is still invalid because it doesn't match with the pattern for an email. Make sense? Everybody okay? All right. All right. So let's continue. One of the things that we might want to be able to do is also provide some feedback on what is wrong, right? For instance, we might want to say span and say that username is required, right? So provide some hints on why is it wrong, right? Why are you complaining, right? If I display this right now, username is required, or we can say another span here as an email is required, right? We might not want to display. Wait, why is it not displaying this? Oh, it has to be above the button. There we go. There it is. So username is required and email is required. But we might not want to show this all the time, right? We might only want to show it if you submit, right? And there's some error, right? Only show these messages strategically, right? So what we could do is use the object we mentioned earlier, right? Here's the object, and we can see, right, that each one of these elements, right, has errors, right? It has errors about being invalid, and what is the specific error, right? So we could say only show, right? Only show those messages when the form1 dot username dot error dot required is true, and show it only then. Yes, makes sense, right? So we could do that. We can grab the object, and the object is this object down here, right? Form1. So show this span only ngIf, right? We can say ngIf only if form1 dot, let's see what else, username dot $error, right, dot required, right? And that, right, if that's the error, then show this message. Let's try it again. Okay, notice that username is still being shown, but as I type, it goes away. See that? Right? And again, I don't want to show this username is required unless I submit. Right? And for that, we have if I submit, notice that there is a submitted true object on the form, right? On the form object. So we could combine those two predicates, saying that, you know, if form1 is submitted, and there is an error, right, with that particular field, right? So let's try it again. Notice that it's not complaining now. It's not showing. Not until I submit. Okay, then it tells me the error message. Make sense? Right? What about the email? The email is a little more complicated, right? Because there are two things that we need to check, right? Whether it's you actually submitted it, and the other one whether it's a valid email, right? So let's have both. Let's copy this span about required. So we could say email is required, and the error would be on the email object, right? On the email function, right? Field. So if I submit, it shows that the email is required. See that? Right. So it's working just like the username, right? But we might want to provide a separate error message if this is not a valid email, right? So let's look at that. Let's look at that. If we do provide an email, notice that the error on the email field. This is very hard to read. Let me copy this. Let's put it back here on the email. Let's see. Do we have an error? Required. Okay, so let me paste that in there. Go there. The email. If we go to the error. Email. See that? Right. There's another error on the which is an email error. Right. So there could be a required error. There could be an email error. Right. And then we can use this, right, to display different messages. So let's copy the same span, right? But we're going to say that we want to display when the form is submitted, and also the error is an email error, right? We can say, and that we can say something like, this is not a valid email. Valid email, right? So let's try it again. Let's refresh. So let's provide both value for both fields so that we can get through the required criteria, and we submit. Notice that this says this is not a valid email. You see that? And this would only go away if indeed we type a correct email. Okay? Notice that this is a very light validation. Okay? For instance, notice that this is not an actual valid domain. Right? If you want to be more specific about the type of domain, right? For instance, that the domain has to be a northeastern domain, or it has to be a specific type of domain, or if we want to really validate that email, most likely we're going to have to go back to the server for this, right? We might want to check that this email is inside of an authentication directory, okay? that this user actually exists, right? And that information we can only go, that information will only be available on the server side, right? But again, we could do some minor validation on the client side. Make sense? Right? And this would be the extent that we would expect you to be doing using for your assignment, for your and for your project. Right? There's quite a bit more validation that we could be doing, but this is plenty for the assignment and for the project, right? As far as Angular is concerned. All right. All right. Again, there could be some additional validation on the server side. Certainly a lot of validation on the database side as well. Right. Okay. I'd like to revisit. Actually, let me stop recording this.